I saw his wedding photos today. His new wife is wearing my dream dress and living my dream life. But what happened next when I saw her age will leave you speechless. I'm sitting here staring at my phone screen and I can't breathe. There's David in a perfect black tuxedo, standing next to this stunning brunette in the exact Vera Wang dress I bookmarked 3 years ago. The same venue I showed him when we were together. The same everything I said I wanted someday when I was ready to settle down. My name's Victoria. I'm 41 and I work in marketing, and the man in these photos used to beg me to marry him 11 years ago when I thought I was way too good for someone who drove a Honda Civic and lived in a studio apartment downtown. I keep scrolling through the album and my heart is pounding harder with each photo. There's his new wife laughing at something he's whispering in her ear. There's them cutting the cake. There's them dancing under fairy lights that look like something out of a Pinterest board I made called My Dream Wedding. And then I see it. The photo that makes my stomach drop to the floor. It's a group shot with all their friends and someone tagged everyone. I click on her name and there it is right at the top of her profile. Age 28, 28 years old. She's everything I was when I first met David, but with one crucial difference. She actually said yes when he proposed. I met David 12 years ago at a networking event downtown. I was 30 then, and I knew I was stunning. I walked into that conference room in my red dress and every head turned. David was standing by the coffee table, looking nervous in his wrinkled button-down shirt. He wasn't my usual type at all, but something about the way he looked at me made me curious. He came over and introduced himself, and I could tell he was intimidated. He worked in IT for some small company I'd never heard of, and he kept apologizing for bothering me. I was already making 6 figures at my marketing firm and dating guys who took me to expensive restaurants on the first date. But David was different. He was genuine in a way that felt rare. When he asked for my number, I almost said no, but something made me give it to him. Maybe it was the way he smiled, or how he actually listened when I talked about my work. Our first date was at Olive Garden. Olive Garden. I remember texting my friend Sarah afterwards saying, "Can you believe this guy took me to a chain restaurant?" She laughed and said at least he paid. I told her barely, and that his car was older than my laptop. But here's the thing. David treated me like I was the most amazing woman in the world. He remembered everything I said. He brought me flowers for no reason. He wrote me actual handwritten notes and left them on my car. When I had a bad day at work, he'd show up with my favorite ice cream and just listen to me vent for hours. My friends thought it was sweet but temporary. Sarah kept saying, "Victoria, you're way out of his league and you know it." My sister Emma would roll her eyes whenever I mentioned him. My mom straight up asked me why I was wasting time with someone who couldn't even afford to take me somewhere nice. And honestly, part of me agreed with them. I was beautiful, successful, and ambitious. I had men with corner offices and luxury cars asking me out. David was sweet, but he was also safe and boring and average. After 6 months, he told me he loved me. We were sitting in his tiny apartment watching Netflix, because that's what we always did, since he couldn't afford to go out much. I remember looking around at his IKEA furniture and thinking, this isn't the life I pictured for myself. I told him I loved him too, but I was lying. I loved how he made me feel, but I didn't love him. Not really. He wasn't ambitious enough, smart enough, successful enough. He was a nice guy, but nice guys don't give you the life you deserve. We dated for 2 years, and during that time, I kept one foot out the door. I'd go on dates with other men when David was working late. I'd flirt with guys at work events. I told myself I was just keeping my options open, because what if someone better came along? Sarah used to say, "You're going to break that poor guy's heart," and I'd tell her he'll be fine. Men always bounce back. Besides, I wasn't doing anything wrong. We weren't engaged or anything. The end came when David started talking about moving in together. He'd gotten a small promotion at work and found a nice 1-bedroom apartment across town. He was so excited, showing me the listing on his phone, talking about how we could split the rent and save money, and maybe even get a dog. I looked at him sitting there on his second-hand couch with his hopeful smile, and I felt trapped. This was not the future I wanted. I was 32 by then, and all my friends were dating lawyers and doctors and entrepreneurs. Sarah had just gotten engaged to a guy who owned 3 restaurants. Emma was living in a penthouse with her boyfriend who worked in finance. And here was David talking about splitting rent on a 1-bedroom apartment like that was some kind of romantic milestone. So I broke up with him. I told him we wanted different things, which was true. I wanted someone who could give me the lifestyle I deserved, and he wanted someone who was happy with average. He was devastated. He kept asking what he did wrong, and I felt terrible because he hadn't done anything wrong. He just wasn't enough. I told him he was a great guy, and he'd find someone perfect for him someday. I actually believed that. I thought he'd be fine. The breakup was messy. He cried, which made me uncomfortable. He asked if we could still be friends, and I said maybe someday, but we both needed space. He moved out of my life completely, and honestly, I was relieved. Within a month, I was dating Marcus, a corporate lawyer, who took me to steakhouses and bought me expensive jewelry. He had everything David didn't. Money, success, ambition. A BMW and a downtown condo with a city view. Marcus and I dated for 8 months before I found out he was also dating his secretary. When I confronted him, he laughed and said, "What did you expect? We never talked about being exclusive." I was furious, but also secretly impressed by how smoothly he handled it. That's what successful men do. They keep their options open. After Marcus came Jonathan, who worked in real estate. He was charming and wealthy, but turned out to be married. Then Ryan, who was a surgeon, but had a gambling problem. Then Michael, who owned a tech startup but was completely self-absorbed. Each relationship lasted a few months before something went wrong. Either they weren't as successful as they seemed, or they were players, or they were workaholics who barely had time for me. I started wondering if all the good men were taken, or if I was just having bad luck. My friends were all getting married one by one. Sarah married her restaurant owner and moved to the suburbs. Emma got engaged to her finance guy, and they bought a house with a 3-car garage. My younger cousin Beth married her college boyfriend, and they seemed genuinely happy even though he was just a high school teacher. I started feeling pressure from my family. My mum would ask when I was going to settle down and give her grandchildren. My dad would joke that I was being too picky and maybe I should lower my standards a little. I'd get defensive and tell them I wasn't going to settle just to be married. But privately, I was starting to worry. I was 35 and still single. The dating pool was getting smaller, and the men my age, who were still available, usually had baggage. Divorced guys with kids or workaholics who'd never been in a serious relationship. I joined expensive dating sites and hired a matchmaker who charged $5,000. She told me I was beautiful and accomplished, but maybe I needed to be more flexible about what I was looking for. I fired her after 3 months because all her setups were with boring middle management types. That's when I started hearing about David through mutual friends. Apparently, he'd gotten promoted again and was doing really well at his company. He'd bought a house in a nice neighborhood and was dating someone seriously. I felt a weird pang when I heard that. Not jealousy exactly, but something close to it. I told myself I was happy for him, but also wondered what kind of woman he was with. Probably someone plain and grateful just to have him. My friend Jessica, who still kept in touch with David's sister, told me he seemed really happy. She said he'd gotten into shape and was more confident than she'd ever seen him. He'd learned to cook and had turned into quite the entertainer, hosting dinner parties at his new house. I laughed when I heard that. David cooking for dinner parties? The same guy who used to take me to Applebee's with coupons. Good for him, I guess, but it was hard to picture. Time kept moving, and I kept dating with a desperation I tried to hide behind designer outfits and confident smiles. I had a 6-month relationship with Richard, a divorced father of 2, who seemed perfect on paper. He was a successful architect with a beautiful house in the suburbs and enough money to take me to all the right restaurants. But 3 months in, I realized he was still completely obsessed with his ex-wife Linda. Every conversation somehow circled back to what Linda used to cook or how Linda decorated their old house, or why Linda left him for her personal trainer. I'd sit there listening to him pine for another woman while paying for expensive dinners, and I finally told him he needed therapy, not a girlfriend. He got defensive and said I was jealous of his past, which was ridiculous because I wasn't competing with some suburban mum who drove a minivan. Then came Tyler, the 28-year-old startup founder, who made me feel ancient despite being only 9 years older than him. He had this tech company that was supposedly revolutionary, though I never really understood what they actually did. He took me to trendy spots in the city where everyone looked like they were barely out of college, and I felt like someone's embarrassing aunt trying to fit in. Tyler would introduce me to his friends as his older woman, which made my skin crawl. We had chemistry, but he had zero emotional depth and treated our relationship like a fun experiment. When I brought up the future, he laughed and said he wasn't ready to think about marriage and kids for at least 10 years. I told him 10 years would make me 50, and he just shrugged like that wasn't his problem. I ended it after he suggested I might want to consider Botox because laugh lines weren't really his thing. After Tyler came a parade of first dates that went nowhere because apparently finding chemistry with quality men was impossible. There was James, the investment banker, who spent the entire dinner talking about his portfolio and asking if I had a financial advisor. When I mentioned I managed my own investments, he looked surprised and said that was unusual for someone in marketing. I wanted to throw my wine in his face, but settled for never returning his calls. Then Michael the surgeon, who showed up 20 minutes late because he was stuck in surgery, which sounded impressive until I realized he was always going to prioritize his career over everything else. He spent our date answering calls from the hospital and apologizing while clearly loving the attention. When I suggested we reschedule for when he had more time, he said this was his life, and any woman who dated him needed to understand that. I understood perfectly, which is why I blocked his number. There was Paul, the real estate mogul, who seemed successful until I Googled him and found out his company was being investigated for fraud. Our second date was at a chain restaurant because apparently his assets were frozen. He spent 2 hours explaining how it was all a misunderstanding and how he'd be back on top within months. I nodded politely while thinking about how David used to take me to Olive Garden because that's what he could afford, not because federal agents had seized his bank accounts. The worst was probably Brian, the divorced lawyer, who seemed normal until our third date when he started getting emotional over his pastor about how his ex-wife ruined his life. He showed me photos of their old house and their dog and explained in detail how she'd manipulated the divorce proceedings to take everything. I sat there watching this grown man break down over chicken parmesan and wondered how I'd become the type of woman who attracted emotional disasters. When he asked if I wanted to come back to his studio apartment, I made an excuse about having to work early. Each failed relationship made me more bitter and defensive. My friends would ask how dating was going, and I'd make jokes about the shortage of quality men in this city. I'd blame dating apps for attracting weirdos, or complain that successful men my age only wanted trophy wives half their age. I never once considered that maybe I was the problem, or that my standards were unrealistic. In my mind, I was a catch who kept running into defective men who couldn't appreciate what I had to offer. The irony was that with each disaster, I found myself thinking about David more often. Not romantically, but practically. David would never have shown up late to dinner, or cried about his ex, or made me feel old and used. David had treated me with respect and consistency, even when he couldn't afford fancy restaurants or designer gifts. But I'd push those thoughts away because David was ancient history, and besides, he probably hadn't changed much from the awkward guy I remembered. I started lying about my age on dating apps. Just a few years, nothing dramatic. But it felt necessary because men my age were dating women in their early 30s, and I needed to stay competitive. My late 30s were rough. I watched my friends have babies and buy bigger houses while I was still living in the same apartment I'd had since my 20s. I was successful at work and making good money, but coming home to an empty place every night was getting depressing. I started going to therapy, and my therapist, Dr. Martinez, kept asking me what I really wanted in a partner. I'd give her my usual list: successful, ambitious, attractive, financially stable. She'd nod and then ask me about emotional connection and compatibility and shared values. I told her those things mattered too, but they weren't enough on their own. I needed someone who could match my lifestyle and ambitions. She asked me if I'd ever been truly happy in a relationship, and I started to say yes, but then I stopped. The truth was, I hadn't been happy with any of the successful, ambitious men I'd dated. They were exciting at first, but they were also selfish and unreliable and often mean. The only time I remembered feeling genuinely content was with David, but that was different. That was just comfort, not passion. Dr. Martinez asked me what comfort meant to me, and I said it meant settling. She raised her eyebrows and asked if I thought comfort and love could exist together. I said of course, but comfort wasn't enough for someone like me. I was 39 when I ran into David's friend Mike at a coffee shop. We chatted for a few minutes, and he mentioned that David was engaged. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, but I managed to smile and say that was wonderful. Mike told me she was a teacher, and they'd met through a friend. He said David was crazy about her, and they were planning a small wedding for the following year. I asked how old she was, trying to sound casual, and Mike said he thought she was around 27 or 28. I went home that night and looked David up on social media for the first time in years. His profiles were mostly private, but I could see a few photos. He looked good. Really good. He'd lost weight and updated his style, and there was confidence in his smile that hadn't been there when we were together. There were a couple photos with a woman, but I couldn't see her face clearly. She had long dark hair and seemed pretty from what I could tell. In one photo they were hiking, and she was laughing at something off camera. David was looking at her with this expression of pure adoration that I recognized, but had never seen directed at me with that intensity. I felt sick. Not because I wanted David back, but because seeing him happy made me realize how unhappy I was. I was 39 and single, and watching my ex-boyfriend live the life I thought I wanted. I started dating more aggressively after that. I lowered my age range and expanded my geographic area. I went on 3 dates a week sometimes. Most of them were disasters, but I kept trying because what else was I going to do? The men my age who were still single fell into a few categories: recently divorced and bitter, never married workaholics with no social skills, players who were looking for someone to have fun with but not marry. None of them were what I was looking for. The younger men I dated treated me like a fun older woman experience, but not marriage material. The older men wanted someone to take care of them in their golden years. I felt stuck between groups and unwanted by all of them. My 40th birthday was depressing. I threw myself a party and invited everyone I knew. It was a nice event, but I kept looking around at all my single friends and wondering if this was just our lives now. Career women who'd prioritized success over relationships and now had to live with the consequences. Sarah, who was married with 2 kids, by then pulled me aside that night and said, "Victoria, I love you, but you need to be realistic about what's available at our age." I told her I wasn't going to settle for someone just to avoid being alone. She looked at me with this sad expression and said, "Remember David? He was good to you and you threw him away because he wasn't impressive enough. Now look where you are." I got angry and told her that was completely different, but she just shrugged and walked away. That conversation haunted me for weeks. I kept thinking about David and wondering what would have happened if I'd been more patient, if I'd given him time to grow and succeed. But then I'd remind myself that I made the right choice. I couldn't have known he'd eventually become successful, and besides, I deserved someone who was ambitious from the start. I was 41 when the wedding photos appeared on my Instagram feed. I hadn't looked at David's social media in over a year, but apparently we had enough mutual friends that the algorithm decided to show me his happiness. The first photo was just him in his tuxedo, looking handsome and confident. I almost scrolled past it, but something made me stop. He looked so genuinely happy. Not the nervous, uncertain David I remembered, but a man who was completely comfortable in his own skin. Then I saw the photo of them together, and my heart stopped. She was beautiful in an effortless, natural way. The kind of pretty that doesn't need a lot of makeup or expensive clothes. She was glowing with happiness, and looking at David like he was the most amazing man in the world. But it was the dress that really got to me. The exact Vera Wang design I'd been obsessing over for years. Strapless, with delicate beading, and a flowing skirt that looked like something a princess would wear. I'd shown that dress to David once when we were browsing wedding websites for his cousin's engagement party. I scrolled through the entire album like I was torturing myself. The venue was gorgeous, a garden setting with fairy lights and white roses everywhere. The kind of romantic wedding I'd always dreamed of having. Their friends all looked happy and successful. Not rich exactly, but comfortable and content. The kind of people who seemed to have their lives figured out. In every group photo, David and his wife were in the center smiling and laughing, like they couldn't believe their good luck. I clicked on her profile and there it was. Age 28, profession elementary school teacher. Recent posts about their honeymoon in Italy and how grateful she was to marry her best friend. Her best friend? David had been her best friend before he was her husband. I looked through more of her photos and saw their relationship progression over the past 3 years. Casual dating photos that became more serious, holiday pictures with both their families, a proposal photo where she was crying with happiness, and David was kneeling in front of her, looking nervous but determined. In every single photo, they looked genuinely happy. Not the posed fake happiness of social media, but real joy. The kind of contentment I'd never experienced with any of my successful, ambitious boyfriends. I read through the comments on their wedding photos, and they were all genuine congratulations. People saying they were perfect for each other and that they'd never seen David so happy. His sister wrote that she'd never seen him smile so much and that his wife was the best thing that ever happened to him. I wanted to close the app, but I couldn't stop looking. Here was the life I'd always said I wanted. Beautiful wedding, gorgeous venue, handsome, successful husband. But it wasn't mine. It belonged to a 28-year-old teacher who'd never doubted that David was good enough for her. I started thinking about all the ways my life could have been different. If I'd stayed with David, if I'd been patient, if I'd seen his potential, instead of focusing on what he lacked. We could have grown together. I could have supported his career while he supported mine. But then I reminded myself that I'd made the right choice based on the information I had at the time. David wasn't successful when we were together. He didn't have ambition or money or any of the things I needed in a partner. I couldn't have predicted that he'd eventually become the kind of man I wanted to marry. Except looking at these photos, I realized something that made my stomach turn. David hadn't really changed that much. He was still the same kind, thoughtful, genuine person he'd always been. He just had more money now and better clothes and a house instead of an apartment. The core of who he was had always been there. I'd just been too shallow to see it. I'd been so focused on the external markers of success that I'd missed the character traits that actually make a good husband. Loyalty, kindness, reliability, emotional intelligence. All the successful men I'd dated since David had been missing those qualities. They'd had the money and ambition I thought I wanted, but they'd also been selfish and unreliable and incapable of the kind of love David had offered me. I sat there staring at the wedding photos and finally understood what I'd thrown away. Not just a boyfriend, but a partner. Someone who would have supported my dreams while building his own. Someone who would have celebrated my successes instead of competing with them. David's wife got to have the wedding I wanted because she'd recognized what I'd been too proud to see. That a good man with potential is worth more than a successful man without character. I thought about all the years I'd wasted dating the wrong people. All the therapy sessions where I'd complained about the lack of quality men. All the nights I'd gone to bed alone in my expensive apartment, wondering why I couldn't find someone who loved me the way David had loved me. The answer was right there in front of me. I had found someone who loved me that way. I just hadn't thought he was good enough for me. I closed Instagram and sat there staring at my empty apartment. She's 28, I'm 41. but I'm still prettier, more successful, more everything. I just don't understand why I'm the one who's alone. Subscribe if you think some people never learn from their mistakes, hit that. Like, if you've ever seen someone reject the perfect person, and tell me in the comments, do you think she'll ever realize what she lost, or will she keep making the same mistakes forever?